The Bratz versus Barbie feud, and more largely the feud between MGA Entertainment and Mattel, is impossible to escape in fashion doll circles. The competition between the two is a huge defining presence in the toy industry even today, and is evidenced in a lot of different ways. I won't go into the entire history of the debacle because I simply do not have the time, but I did want to talk about one specific instance of their rivalry.
My joy, my toy, my kicks, my chicks.
Mattel's My Scene, a sort of Barbie spin-off made directly as an answer to Bratz, and also to capture the market of tween girls where Barbie has historically underperformed. Due to being derivative of Bratz, My Scene often gets written off as being like a knockoff, but I personally think that's a little unfair. For one, it's precisely this kind of competition that drives the creativity of toy companies. And two, My Scene definitely has enough great things about it that I think it stands on its own. So, just for fun, I wanted to compare the two against each other more directly and see how they stand up against each other. Let's start with the basics. Bratz, introduced in 2001, stand 10 inches tall with very stylized proportions and are most recognizable by their detailed makeup screenings, their large pouty lips, and their removable feet. They're marketed as being contemporary, edgy, and always fashion forward. The core characters are Chloe, Yasmin, Jade, and Sasha, though there's an incredibly large cast of secondary characters too. My Scene, debuting in 2002, are more proportional to regular Barbie dolls, but with larger heads and oversized shoes molded to fit their regular tiny Barbie feet. The core group consists of a teenage Barbie and her friends Madison and Chelsea, and then later Noli and Delancey, and then later Kennedy and Nia. A fun detail about the cast is that all the characters are named after and wear fashions inspired by different parts of New York City. Bratz didn't really have a dedicated storyline so much as a collection of characters and concepts, but My Scene centered pretty firmly around a group of friends exploring young adulthood in NYC while experiencing the different facets of a big city life. Bratz is always pretty consistent about who its main characters are. In the early days, however, the girls didn't really have incredibly distinct personalities. They were a group of friends who loved shopping and partying and fashion, but we weren't really given much beyond that. Which is fine. The line was way more about the fashions than it was the characters, and it didn't really pretend to be anything else. One of my favorite things about My Scene, though, is how well established the characters were from the very beginning. We learned pretty much immediately who they all are. Barbie is the basic girl next door who loves planning parties and organizing hangouts. Madison is the strong-willed and sensitive songwriter who loves to shop. Chelsea is a friendly, sweet-hearted girl who loves designing clothes and vintage fashions. Noli and Delancey are both like the sporty skater girls, but Noli is more zen and spiritual, while Delancey is more domineering and rebellious. Of course, they all have their respective boyfriends as well. On top of distinct personalities, we got secondary materials like blog posts or diary entries that gave us even more insight into the characters. Obviously, it wasn't anything super in-depth, but My Scene is the first doll line I remember putting that much effort into crafting characters you could really identify with. It was so easy to have a favorite character, either because you liked their style or you identified with their personality. Now, over the years, Bratz did craft more clear personalities for the characters, particularly in the movies and the TV series, but as a whole, it has just never been a huge focus. That said, I do think the qualities we have are really fun and unique. For instance, I've always loved the fact that Chloe is meant to be the sweet girl next door archetype, but also has a much edgier, somewhat more rebellious side. Jade's always been my personal favorite, though. I love that she's usually depicted as creative and artistic, with an affinity for the more punk rock or experimental aesthetics. But for the most part, Bratz just has so many characters with no discernible personality. There's definitely an appeal for a doll line with tons of characters, but so many of these girls just blend together and are difficult to identify outside of their name because they just don't have any unique characteristics. Bratz did somewhat try to remedy this with the 2015 reboot, but I don't really want to spend a lot of time on that since it came long after my scene. That and other reasons. Whereas for my scene, even their more minor characters like Kinsey or Jai are still very distinct from the main cast. In that sense, I think it was much smarter of my scene to have a much smaller, cozier cast with a fun dynamic, so they could put effort into developing them as characters. Even Barbie was portrayed as flawed and prone to mistakes, something almost unheard of at this point. Whether it's a good or bad thing, objectively though, really depends on who you ask. Some people would say that fashion dolls should first and foremost be a vehicle for displaying strong, well-constructed fashions that you can mix and match. And in that sense, Bratz definitely succeeds. But others prefer well-established characters that they can relate to, so it all comes down to personal preference. One area that Bratz definitely wins is its diversity, though. They deserve major props for prioritizing a multicultural group of characters and ensuring that the children playing with them had at least one character somewhere that they could see themselves in. To that extent, the giant cast is for sure a positive. The racial diversity wasn't always perfect. There were definitely issues with whitewashing down the line, but they did a better job as a whole than my scene did, in my opinion. So, Bratz has 15 movies and my scene has 3. Bratz also had 2 seasons of an animated series in the same style as the CGI movies, while my scene had a webisode series that ran in continuity with the movies. The Bratz movies are remembered mainly for being kind of insane. The plots were very high concept, action-packed, and frequently dipped into fantasy territory. The Bratz Pack did it all. They were rock stars, they were pixies, they were genies, they were babies. Whatever your opinion on them, they're definitely memorable. Comparably, the My Scene movies were a lot more low-key. They did exciting things like go on vacation to Jamaica or star in a Hollywood movie, but the focus was always more on simple, relatable things like relationship drama or having trouble at school. The movies are definitely very relaxing and low stakes. I think that the animation of the My Scene movies also holds up much better than the Bratz movies. It's not amazing, but the CGI in most of the Bratz movies just has not aged well, and it's rather difficult to watch sometimes. This might be petty, but I also think the My Scene movies just did a better job of actually promoting the dolls too. The fashions were never a huge focus in the plot, but they were there and used pretty well. Something that bothered me, even as a kid, is that the Bratz animation often had the girls dressed in the completely wrong outfits, or sometimes main characters will just be recolors of one another. It just felt like they didn't put a lot of effort into it, honestly. And yet, despite my criticisms of the Bratz movies, I remember them much better than I do the My Scene ones. No, maybe they weren't the most well-written or consistent, but they were definitely fun and exciting to watch, and if you have even an inch of nostalgia for the Bratz movies, you definitely remember how crazy they are. And if you don't, well, what are you doing? Go watch them right now. All 15 of them. Yes, even Bratz super babies. In the end, I think it just comes down to what mood you're in when it comes to the movies. Though I do think My Scene deserves points for having Lindsay Lohan as a character. Not a parody of Lindsay Lohan, just straight up the Lindsay Lohan. We also cannot talk about the Media Association without also talking about the My Scene website. Even if you didn't play with the dolls, you probably have some severe nostalgia for the Flash games on the old website. I rarely meet someone who hasn't admitted to spending hours picking outfits or doing their nails. It's kind of amazing, really, how memories of this website have endured, even though the games in it were pretty basic. I guess it just kind of existed in exactly the right time period. Okay, We can talk all day about the characters or the movies, but it's an undeniable fact that a fashion doll will be judged first and foremost by the fashion. One thing that I think my scene did really well is having each character have a personal style. Madison is dressed very glam and luxurious, Chelsea wore vintage prints and upcycled clothes, Noli and Delancey were usually pretty sporty, etc. The designers clearly put a lot of thought into this too, as their fashion styles are pretty consistent across the dolls. I never really got that impression very heavily with Bratz. In fact, there's a lot of lines where everyone is just wearing the same exact outfit with only slight differences, and in the lines they're not, it doesn't always feel like the girls' personalities were taken into account. I can only praise my scene for this for so long, though. In its later era, after they replaced Barbie with Kennedy for no discernible reason considering they're the exact same character, the outfits started to get more samey and we lost a lot of the individuality we got in the early days. The outfits got much more glamorous too. In the early days, the fashions were predominantly much more everyday, like shopping in the city or eating at a cafe kind of outfits, but in the Kennedy or the Bling era, it's more like club wear. These dolls are still beautiful and usually fairly high quality, but I think conceptually they're just weaker compared to the Barbie era. Compared to either era though, I think Bratz fashions in general are still much stronger. They may not be as tailored to the characters, but they still had a wide variety of lines and concepts and served high fashion every time. Now, Bratz has definitely had its weaker moments, but the highs were very high. They were constantly pushing the limits on what fashion dolls could accomplish. My scene had its moments of pushing boundaries as well, but I don't think it ever quite reached the levels of Bratz on that front. Bratz fashion, especially in the period when they were competing with my scene, is so much fun because it comes from so many different inspirations. The Bratz could be flirty and youthful, or they could be super glamorous, or they could be edgy and punk. They switched up their looks so much, but were always very clearly the Bratz. There were so many different concepts, and they were delivered so well. I think this is where my scene's consistency as a brand actually served as sort of detriment. The fashions were fun and they were well designed, but they never stepped too far out of their box, and for that reason they just don't have many standout lines. When I think of Bratz lines that are particularly iconic and still very sought after to this day, I think of Wintertime Wonderland, Pretty and Punk, Girls Night Out, Tokyo Go-Go, Slumber Party, Princess, Sweet Dreams, and more. When I think of my scene lines with the same impact, I think of Masquerade Madness. Uh, I guess Roller Girls too, and maybe Growing Up Glam, but for all the wrong reasons. Considering my scene ended in 2011 and Bratz has been going on and off since its debut, it's easy to see which brand has had more long-term impact. I don't think my scene was doing anything wrong necessarily, but they just weren't ever pushing it as far as Bratz was. Even though they were younger and trendier than Barbie, they were still pretty consistently safe in a lot of ways. Bratz, on the other hand, changed the toy industry completely and paved the way for countless other doll lines, my scene included. They not only completely changed the way that the world looked at fashion dolls, but they also showed the world that representation and diversity in toys is not only important, but necessary in a lot of ways. My scene had a comparably smaller and more localized kind of impact, but still a significant one. Prior to my scene, Barbie was always kind of portrayed as perfect, untouchable, and on an entirely different level from her friends. I think that my scene showed Mattel that there was a market to portraying Barbie as a three-dimensional, more vulnerable character. If you were to ask me straight up, which is better, though, my answer would always be the same. Why must we pit powerful women against each other? While Bratz definitely has more longevity and impact in the long run, my scene carved out its own niche in the doll world and did a lot of things very successfully. At the end of the day, it all comes down to what you look for in a doll line. And while it's fun to play into these rivalries, I firmly believe that when you discredit an entire brand because of your loyalties, you might be missing out on something great. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know in the comments which one of the two is your favorite, what your favorite dolls from either Bratz or my scene are, if you agree or even if you disagree with anything I've said. This is very new to me and I'm still figuring everything out, so any support or engagement with this channel is greatly appreciated. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, please subscribe and let me know what you would like to see next. Thank you.